Pipette tips. They're basically the toilet paper in the lab where it's a one and done.
Toilet paper?
That's why in this video, we're gonna talk about the best tips on how to choose your pipette tips. Yeah, man, you just use it once. One and done. It's not like you reuse a pipette tip.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, literally.
I think you just need to, pipe it down.
You're an absolute.
Where are you going?
How about you pipe it down?
Why should you choose your pipette tips carefully? The end goal for every lab is to create highly accurate and standardized results for your sample. So this means we want to make sure that every factor that could affect that is accounted for, including pipette tips. And if we don't use the correct pipette tips or use something that isn't the best quality, then this could potentially cause problems like wasting your precious samples and reagents, or even cause repetitive stress injury. That's why the first thing you should do for any lab is making sure you choose high quality pipette tips from a reputable supplier. So how do you know?
We're a reputable supplier.
So how do you know if it's high quality? So a great pipette tip is made up of quality virgin polypropylene.
Virgin?
What that fancy word means is that it's a medical grade plastic that can handle a wide range of applications, from corrosive material to something that's viscous without altering the sample. You also want to make sure that there isn't any plastic or metal additives within your pipette tips so that it doesn't affect your results. And if you're testing with sensitive microbiological or PCR testing, you want to make sure that they are certified to be free of RNAs, DNA, pyrogen, PCR inhibitors, and ATP. In other words, you don't want anything in your pipette tips that could potentially alter results. For example, let's say that you're doing a PCR test for a patient and you just coincidentally happen to notice that there are traces of RNA left on the pipette tip for some reason. Then what could happen is that these results could potentially be amplified, leading to a false positive in your results. At the end of the day, a high quality pipette tip ensures that your results will be reliable, so you could focus more on your experiments rather than worrying if there's something wrong with your lab supplies. The second thing to consider is choosing between universal or proprietary tips and making sure it fits snugly. You see, not all pipette tips are equal. I hate to break it to you, but they aren't. That's the reality. But what this means for you is that not every pipette tip is going to fit into your pipette. This means it should easily attach itself, it can stay in place with no effort, and there should be a strong seal between your pipette and pipette tips. And the reason why you want to do this is because if there is a poor seal between your pipette tip and your pipette, then this could potentially mean that the drawn out air will escape, which will affect the amount of liquid in the pipette tip, and that's no bueno. So one thing to consider is that there should be compatibility charts between your pipettes and pipette tips to make sure that it fits. Another thing to consider is getting proprietary tips versus universal tips. Proprietary tips just means that you're using the name brand for your specific pipette, and universal pipette tips are designed to be compatible with most brands. You could think of toilet paper again, or you could either use Charmin Ultra Strong, or you could use a generic toilet paper brand. They both can get the job done. However, Charmin Ultra Strong definitely costs more, but you know that they are more reliable versus a generic toilet paper brand, which will definitely be cheaper and still do a great job. But since there's no name brand, you feel a little skeptical about it until you use it. It's the same exact thing with pipette tips. You see, you can't go wrong with proprietary tips, but if you're on a budget, you may want to consider looking at universal pipette tips. And as its name suggests, it's universal. So it fits with most brands due to flexible technology to ensure there is a great seal, helping to secure the pipette and pipette tip. Just like all generic toilet paper, not all universal pipette tips are the same, meaning you also want to make sure and double check that the brand you choose, if you're doing universal pipette tips, is high quality. This means 1, making sure it's not inconsistent, or 2, that cheap material is used for the build of the pipette tips. The next decision you have to make is choosing if you want a non-filtered or filtered tip. In general, you want to choose the non-filtered pipette tips if you're handling any non-sensitive application for your experiment that also won't contaminate your pipettes, and these pipette tips are typically usually cheaper. However, if you are handling any clinical samples, viscous samples, or even corrosive samples, then using a filter tip would be your best choice. Let's dive in when you should consider non-filtered tips. You see, non-filtered tips are great for non-sensitive applications. Usually they're used for applications like agarose gels or even plasmid DNA. Typically, you use them when there isn't too much concern about it contaminating your pipettes and affecting your future samples. And these are great because they are the inexpensive choice that usually comes in bulk or pre-racked, which means more experiments for you at a lower cost. Filter tips, on the other hand, are used in cases where you are handling sensitive materials that may contaminate your samples. Ironically, most filter tips, also known as a barrier tip, doesn't have a physical barrier, like only the high-end ones, and instead slow down the speed of which the sample comes in so that it is much harder to accidentally go into your pipette. That's why they are also a perfect choice to help train new individuals using a pipette for the first time. This is because the filter helps prevent over-aspiration, so taking too much sample, which could potentially save your pipette from having to be cleaned and repaired, which costs money. So if you are running a lab filled with students or training new lab techs, filtered pipette tips are the way to go. They are also great for handling any low volume material that is RNA, DNA solutions, infectious samples, radio-labeled samples, volatile, corrosive, or viscous samples, strong acids or bases, genetic studies, forensics, or even something like radioisotope samples. All right, I need water. This is... Another thing to consider when using filtered pipette tips is making sure that you keep your pipettes clean. For example, let's go back to PCR testing and say you decided to use non-filtered pipette tips. Doesn't seem that terrible, right? What could potentially happen is that if there is any cross-contamination in your sample, then it can be amplified during the process, giving you false positive results. And having inaccurate results for patients can be really bad. So be sure to choose the right pipette tips for your specific applications to get accurate results.
People can die.
Fourth thing to consider is using low retention pipette tips because they just don't hurt to have. Just like the name implies, what low retention tips means is that they retain low levels of liquids. This is because the inner surface of This is because the inner surface is hydrophobic, making it easier to release the liquid of the pipette tip and making it harder to stick to the surface. They are becoming more and more popular because they are considered the more premium tips, as there are no downsides with 1, improved sample delivery, and 2, using the expensive reagents more effectively. That's why they are great for PCR, cloning, or any other protein analysis applications. However, you want to make sure that there is no secondary process during manufacturing that can cause these compounds to leach from the tips, such as during silicone coating. What happens is when manufacturers are producing low retention tips, they typically use either a different polypropylene blend to their standard tips or add a silicone coating. And this is because both techniques prevent viscous or low surface tension liquids from spreading out and wetting the inner walls of the tips. However, the latter has one major disadvantage. A silicone coating can wash or leach out with your sample. So you should always choose tips with a polypropylene blend offering heightened hydrophobic properties to make sure that liquid repellents can't contaminate your samples. So those are the main things to consider when choosing a pipette tip. Now let's go over some pipette tips in special cases where they are nice features to have for pipette tips, but not essential to have. One of them is graduated pipette tips. Graduated pipette tips have graduated marks on the side, which helps as a precaution to make sure that you have an accurate sample. It also reminds you to pay attention to your pipette technique to ensure that you are always measuring out the right amount of samples. The second one would be ergonomic tips. Ergonomic tips basically means that it requires less insertion and ejection force when you're manually pipetting. See, what this means for you is that this can help reduce the strain on your wrists and help prevent repetitive stress injury. In other words, a tip that is designed specifically for your pipette is considered an ergonomic tip. Another variation is the specialty tips. Specialty tips are specialized for specific purposes. The reason why you would get them is to either save time, reduce contamination, or improve accuracy for a specific method. And you may need to have a specific pipetter for your specialized tip. Then there are the wide orifice tips.
Wide orifice.
The benefit of the wide orifice tips is that they're usually larger to help provide Then there's the wide orifice tips. We're almost done. The benefit of the wide orifice tips is that they're usually larger to help provide the flexibility for handling pipette samples that are difficult. It's perfect for you if you're working on things like, macromolecules, with genomic DNA, transferring fragile cellular samples, or any viscous material. There are also gel loading tips. Gel loading tips just mean that you're putting acrylamide or agarose gels inside a standard pipette tip, which can take a long time, so you want to get a specialized loading tips to help speed up the process. And then there are solvent-safe carbon tips. These tips are best for handling combinatorial chemistry to help keep strong acids, bases, and organic solvents from causing pipette failures. And finally, there are the single-wrapped pipette tips. And as its name suggests, each pipette tip is individually wrapped with special care, love, attention, and the main reason why you want to get these is for extremely sensitive applications requiring strict conditions to be sterile. That wraps it up. Choosing your pipette tips is important,
test it out.
so you can get accurate results without contaminating your pipettes or purchase samples. And you also want to consider before you purchase your pipette tips to ask for samples to make sure they work with your machines and pipettes. If you want more videos like this, be sure to like and smash that subscribe button. Or if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below and we'll get back to you.
Or we won't. Or we won't.
You have anything else to say, Nick?
Yes. And if you're looking for pipette tips like the ones Mr. DeBell described, check the link in the description for the lowest price or the fastest delivery. You can pick two and only two. Low price, fast delivery. Link in description.
Thank you, Nick.
I won't miss with the toilet paper next time.